Dear cousins, OJT marks the beginning of the end of PST for Peace Corps volunteers like myself. We were both anxious to be free of the COVID-era confinements to the campus of our training center and filled with anxiety over the yet unseen host communities that we plan to live with for the next 2 years. This was the first opportunity for us to prove that we'd been paying attention after 2 months of language and culture lessons. We were to be dropped off with our host families, and there we would have the chance to traverse the cultural gap. Or not. The challenge of this assignment reminded me of one of the best YouTube videos ever made. Choose Not to Fall, a short documentary about Daniel Ilabaka, in which the famous practitioner of parkour frequently and fearlessly puts himself into perilous positions, leaping through the air and over the pavement with flippant disregard for the architect's intent and personal safety. My internal rescreening of this video was interrupted by my program manager asking me to stick around after the meeting for a private conversation. In her signature tone of subdued concern, she informed me that there had been a death in the family. One of the two patriarchs, my host father's brother, had died just days before I was scheduled to arrive. As a result, if I chose to participate in OJT as planned, the bulk of my time would be occupied by the funeral. I was now moving in with the family in mourning, and as vertigo set in, as the cultural gap between myself and my host community seemed to widen before my eyes, I remembered the conclusion of Ilabaka's video.
Confidence isn't gained over time of practice. It's like confidence is gained when you realize that you choose your own path. You choose to fall, you choose not to fall. Just that outlook on life helps me to be more free myself.
Although I was, and still am not, Ilabaka, and I was bound to make mistakes, I trusted that at the end of my strength was the beginning of a greater one. I tensely rocked, rattled, and rumbled through green forested hills, on roads riddled with the imprints of hooves. Then, as I exited the Peace Corps branded SUV and my comfort zone, I was embraced with an overwhelming greeting. My host mother, whom I was immediately informed should be addressed as Mage, summoned her best English and her brightest smile to help introduce me to my new life.
Welcome, Poti. Toby Sitabete.
Shout out to those who told me Toby was their pet name.
Many mothers here name their children according to the time, the circumstance in which they were born. So I am Mtobisi, a comforter in the time of mourning.
Welcome, Putigakulu. Thank you very much.
Traditions dictate that mourning is done in a few stages, potentially taking a couple of years. The first stage, the funeral, has its own unique steps and takes about a week. They begin with Gubiga. The death is announced, preparations for the funeral are made, and the loss is reported to Umpagazzi, a type of local authority. The community, as a result, comes to comfort the bereaved in two main groups, Gulila and Gwekuta. The first is the women mourning with the women. They do so Elindlini Gagogo. This is the homestead's center house where the ancestors are said to reside. This is the meeting place of the home, the mourning house. And this is a place where, if there is a widow, she traditionally begins wearing the black mourning clothes. The men get together Eswatini. This is a place usually at the back of the homestead, reserved for burying loved ones. They gather there to begin the work of preparing this space for the burial. Third is Umlinzelo, a vigil that begins on Saturday night and extends into Sunday morning, which is followed by Guya Mduneni, a sacred procession to the gravesite where Umqabo takes place. the funeral ceremony, preparing the dirt for the grave. I arrived on the homestead where the funeral was to be held, ready to work. I saw my host sister and promptly asked where the men were. She took me by the hand and reminded me to remove my shoes before stepping under the round tiled roof at the center of this property. Reluctantly, I entered the lilondo in silent awe. I was surrounded by seated women wrapped in vibrant color, but with somber faces. This sight told me that I wasn't where I wanted to be, yet I was being privy to something. I was quickly prompted to sit and greet, the one part of Eswatini speech where I felt confident, so I humbly announced from my seat on the grass mat, Sanbonani, setting in motion the usual sequence of pleasantries. As I inhaled a sigh of relief, my breath was interrupted by the sight of Mage's concern and the sound of her English. I stuttered and struggled and summoned a well-rehearsed Likamalami Ntobis. This introduction was answered with a phrase that I didn't understand, but was later told required a response that I didn't give. So my host sister promptly took me by the hand again and took me where I wanted to go. Once with the men, I knew I was where I wanted to be. Neighbors and cousins stood around here and there, watching and jawing while waiting for their turn to replace one of the two men digging the new grave on the fence line, just behind the houses, next to an older grave. Eswatini. It was apparent that I could have just introduced myself to the guys and then received credit for being that foreigner who showed up for the bereaved. However, Mage named me for more than that. A bald, lean yet muscular elder with skin cured by years of work in the sun, skillfully carved out 4 perpendicular corners into the dirt with a pickaxe. He and a younger cousin began to heave residual heaps of loose dirt up to the surface. I saw my window of opportunity when one of them grew tired of shoveling. I dropped into the hole and channeled all of my experience working outdoors with my dad as I flung the dirt up to the growing pile. Laughter erupted. My digging partner shook his head and motioned for us to switch sides in the grave. In my defense, he was hitting me with debris too. I continued to submit my best efforts to my gracious, if mocking, brothers. Physically and mentally exhausted, I retired early, finding new comfort in my foam mattress on the floor of my new, empty, concrete octagon. At 4:30 a.m., my alarm seemed to chime on the beat of the never-ending chorus of the night vigil next door. I quickly rose to attend the latter half of the service, dressed in layers to protect me from the cold, equipped with all of my techniques for staying awake in church. I stood on the periphery of the crowd, outside of the blue and white revival tent. I didn't comprehend the language of their grieving, but I felt them loud and clear. Preachers' exasperated voices blared through the speakers. Hymns and scripture were chanted in response as the horizon changed its colors. By sunrise, I was no longer standing on the outside of the crowd. It felt like every single one of the 2,000 inhabitants of this village hidden by the hills was gathered to bury this man. When the day was fully lit, I was swept up by a current of Eswatini gathering around the newly built grave. I couldn't see the casket being lowered, nor could I see the soldiers firing their rifles in salute. But as clearly as I heard the shots, I heard the pleas, the prayers, and the praises of the bereaved. I'm a vocal opponent of any kinds of determinism, but I do believe that one's genesis is written in a way that is relevant to later revelations, which is why this funeral felt to me like an initiation. To be clear, this somber event was in no way about me, but as I worked with the men, as I mourned with the women, as I ate with the boys. And as I congregated with the community, I couldn't help but feel like this was the end of my beginning as a volunteer. I have been, from that point, with my host community. He has been, from that point, with the ancestors. I don't pretend to understand the nuances of Eswatini Zionist theology that this family adheres to, but a couple of things have been made clear to me. The eternal rest with the ancestors is a fate inherited only by the righteous. And this funeral marked the end of his life and the beginning of his eternity. Choose not to fall.
If you're afraid to fall, you fall because you're afraid. Everything is choice.